Hi, my name's Michael, and this is the first in a series of videos that I'm going to call Philosophical Investigations. It's an overused name, it's been used before, but it really does sum up what I'm going to be trying to do, which is not just sort of making some kind of self-published lecture on philosophy, but really thinking about some of the issues that really I'm quite passionate about, that I think are important and I'm concerned about, and trying to see how much philosophy can help us in dealing with them. I'm doing it as much to help clarify my own thinking for me as I am for anybody who might listen to this, which is lucky because normally when I make videos like this, not very many people do watch them, but we'll have to see. In this first one, I really want to talk about, I want to introduce myself and talk a little bit about what philosophy actually is. So I studied philosophy as a mature student at primarily at UCL. I did a master's at King's College London, but I'm afraid from my point of view that was a bit of a mistake. I never really clicked with King's, and although I had wanted to go on and do a doctorate after my master's, I was having some personal problems. I was having some quite serious financial problems, also some, I suppose, mental health issues, dealing with some difficult things from my childhood that were coming out, and it was quite a hard time. So I ended up going off and working for London Underground, training, well, first as a guard, then as a driver, and then training train drivers. But I've never lost my passion for philosophy, and I don't actually regret not having stayed in academia. I'm not sure that academia is the best environment for real philosophy. I mean, amongst other things, these days there's incredible pressure on you to publish. Most of the greats would not have thrived in this modern environment. You know, Wittgenstein did not keep pumping out papers. Neither did Immanuel Kant. Socrates never published a single paper that we know of. Everything we know about him comes through Plato and other authors, if he was indeed a historical figure. Also, see, I became involved with philosophy. I became passionate about philosophy because I had problems in my life and I didn't know how to deal with them. Some of those were, I went through a difficult childhood. I went through some very difficult things, and I went through some quite difficult things as a young adult. And like many people who go through some of these things, I was very confused and uncertain about what had actually happened. I had issues with my memory. There were issues with whether people close to me were telling the truth. So a huge amount of uncertainty and a great deal of difficulty about how to proceed. And while some of this was depression, you know, I suffered from depression when I was younger, and, you know, I now recognize I had PTSD for many years, untreated and undiagnosed, until I was much older. There was a more fundamental problem, a problem of not so much a psychological or mental health problem, but a problem, a crisis of meaning, a crisis of knowing how to proceed, what the right way to live was. what it was to know something. And I've explored that on various levels, which has included therapy. It's included studying psychology. It's also included the sort of kind of spiritual quest of a 70s, mid-70s hippie. I experimented with psychedelic drugs, mushrooms while they were legal, maybe some other things. But philosophy, it seems to me, held the promise of being able to achieve some kind of understanding of, well, I think Socrates puts it well, the good. He wanted people to understand the good, and to know how to live the good life. So gradually I lost a certain amount of my interest in psychology, and I started to focus much more on philosophy, and it became my passion. And I think there's a reason for that. So one of the things that you'll quite often hear said about philosophy is that every philosopher has their own definition of philosophy. Nobody really agrees or knows what it is. Nobody can tell you what philosophy is. The only way to really come to know what philosophy is by doing it. And, you know, that seems a bit, well, it's a bit like buying a pig in a poke then. You want me to study this subject and you can't tell me what the subject is. In fact, you tell me, well, you're going to have to come and study this subject before you can know what it is. I mean, at least with something like physics, okay, you're not really going to have a clear idea what high energy particle physics is, or string theory or something, without having some sort of background in physics. But at least somebody can start out and say, well, look, what physics is primarily is the study of physical reality, the sort of mechanical physical structure of reality. And you've got an idea what it is. So if we can't do the same thing with philosophy, I think you'd have to wonder, well, is it anything? And I think that this characterization of philosophy is a bit misleading, because I think that what philosophy really is what you do when you don't know how to proceed. It's not a particular discipline. It's not got a finite set of tools. It's not got a well-defined path, because it is what you do when you don't know how to proceed. And what philosophy can give you actually isn't answers. What philosophy can give you is tools for trying to tease some sort of coherence, some sort of path out of the chaos and uncertainty when you don't know how to proceed. You see, one thing that people quite often think when they hear about philosophy, if you hear you're a philosopher, that you're studying philosophy, is they sort of say, what's the point? I mean, philosophy's never, ever achieved anything. It's, you know, it's the only subject where you would read the writings of somebody from 2000 years ago and treat it as relevant today. And, okay, historians look at ancient sources, but they look at ancient sources in a particular way. You know, physicists might read Aristotle, but they don't read Aristotle in order to understand contemporary physics. They're just interested in the history of their discipline. And, you know, if you're interested in the history of it, well, Aristotle, Bacon, other people, you know, they're important figures in the history, but you don't use their ideas in cutting edge science today. And yet, if you study philosophy, you will still you read Descartes' Meditations, and you won't read it just as a historical book. It will be relevant to understanding contemporary philosophy. The same goes for Socrates. Zeno's paradoxes, right there at the cutting edge of a lot of stuff we're doing today. And that makes it look as though philosophy's never made any progress. But when you understand that it's what we do when we don't know how to proceed, then you see a slightly different story, because actually philosophy has accomplished many things. Right? The modern world, stuff that's happening today, all of this stuff with AI, modern computers, information processing technology stuff, it all goes back to philosophy. It goes back to people like Russell thinking about problems in logic and in mathematics, and questions that are distinctly philosophical about meaning, and trying to understand language because it plays such an important role, and understanding logic because this all plays such an important role in the way that we think and we come to form our beliefs, that if you're examining this whole notion of truth, then you really need to study this stuff. And that gives rise to mathematical logic, and that gradually develops into information technology, and eventually, Alan Turing and people start making actual logical machines, still now having practical applications, solving Enigma, but very much grounded in philosophy. But as it becomes established, as the problems of we don't know how to solve the problems of how to understand reference and meaning and the logical structure of languages, this begins to get sorted out to the point that you can actually build machines that can do this processing, right? It ceases to be philosophy because it isn't a problem anymore. We now know how to proceed. So we don't need to treat this as a philosophical problem anymore. It becomes a technology. It becomes something that we know how to do. I mean, obviously we're learning new things, but we basically know how to proceed with it. And so people look at it, philosophy, and because the only problems that philosophers sort of really stay wrestling with are the ones that we've never been able to adequately sort out. They say, look, you've just got these problems that have been hanging around for thousands of years and you've never made any progress on them. And what they don't see is the enormous range of things that we have made progress with, how much we've given birth to, and in particular, how much philosophy has given birth to the modern world, and all the wonderful technology and stuff that has enriched our lives and made us much more comfortable and given you video games, all the rest of the stuff. Now, in a way, philosophy's been too successful. There are different traditions within philosophy, different flavors of philosophy. My background from UCL, King's, and also the Open University I studied with these, but it's actually very much in what's sometimes called the analytical or the Anglo-American tradition. And that's very much tied up with logic. It's very connected to the empirical sciences, philosophy of science and philosophy of mathematics play quite a big part in it, and it plays quite a big part in them. And we kind of reached a situation where there's a lovely observation in The View from Nowhere, great book by Thomas Nagel, and I'm very much in a similar sort of vein to Thomas. And in that he says that philosophy is really hard. And I think he's absolutely right, because it is difficult. People find it unnerving, uncomfortable to be somewhere where you don't know what to do. You don't know what the score is. There is no established way to go ahead. This is a very uncomfortable and difficult place to be. And if that's genuinely the locus of philosophy, if that's where you do philosophy, when you don't know what the hell's going on, you don't understand, there is no established path, right? Then philosophy is going to be a very hard and uncomfortable thing, and it is, right? Real philosophy. And what Nagel said was that actually it's so difficult that an awful lot of philosophers have basically given up. They have decided that the best way forward, or the only sort of real viable way forward, is to pass the torch on to the empirical sciences. They're the ones who are now better understanding the world. You can't really get to know some deep metaphysical truth just sitting in your armchair meditating on the nature of a lump of wax. Reference there to Descartes' Meditations. And Nagel is objecting to that. Nagel understands the power of the empirical sciences. He knows how much they've done for us. But what he's saying is that there is a problem with the empirical sciences. They're not adequate. They can't give us everything that we need. They can't explain everything that we have to explain. What the sciences ultimately give us is a view from nowhere. But as human beings, we have a view from somewhere. And anything that rejects, throws out the view from somewhere in favour of the view from nowhere, it can never explain, it can never be adequate for what it is to be a human being. And I feel that very strongly. I have always felt that. I really struggled when I was doing psychology. I really struggled. I got interested in psychology at a time when behaviorism was really dominant. The idea that psychology must become a purely empirical science, that we must throw out all the sort of folk psychology nonsense about interior experience, subjective experience. All that you can empirically observe are contingencies of stimulus and response. That's what a truly scientific psychology must be like. And I always struggled with that. Eliminative materialism, the idea that you could explain everything in terms of the physical world. First person experience was just a dead end and meaningless. I mean, that has always, and that to this day, even though I'm very interested in functionalism and some of these physicalist explanations of mind, that remains a fundamental core truth to me. I think that is absolutely central. And that is one of the struggles. I do believe that a society that embraces the empirical sciences as the measure of truth, and that as a result cannot recognize the hopes and feelings, the interior life of its citizens, is a psychopathic and incredibly dangerous society, one that we really don't want to live under. And yet that's the direction we've been going in. And for me, that's a crisis. And that's connected to so many different crises, including, attitudes that come from that are very much connected to the environmental crisis that we face, some of the social issues and problems that we face. We can see this in moral philosophy with the rise of relativism, right? The extension of the view from nowhere into morality, so that eventually you're looking at morality from nowhere, right? There is no ultimate morality. All you can see are the customs and attitudes that were prevalent in different societies. For me, that's not been good enough. I need to know how to live. I want to know what's right and wrong. If there is no right and there is no wrong, then, you know, where does one go? How do you cope with that? Okay, maybe that's the truth. Right? Maybe moral values are simply cultural artifacts. Maybe there is no genuine moral philosophy. Maybe it all reduces to sociology. Right? But that doesn't get us off the hook. Right? It's not enough to say, oh, well, at the end of the day, morality is just a branch of sociology, or at least understanding morality. It's just sociology. There's no real way to choose between them. None is more right than any other. They're just what different people think at different times. I still want to know what's good for me to think, right? What's bad for me to think. And these philosophical investigations in this thing, I'm going to address an awful lot of those issues. Maybe I have something. I mean, maybe some of you will actually find what I have to say on this interesting, because this world that we're going into, in which, you know, conspiracy theories are exploding, we have post-truth sort of media, academia has sort of become I don't know, disconnected from a lot of the society. We're going through changes. We don't understand where we're going. I mean, in the physical sciences, we don't understand where we're going really. We've had quantum mechanics now since really the beginning of the 20th century. We're now a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and we're still pretty clueless about what, if anything, it actually means. Mathematics. I mean, the thing I did my master's in was the history and philosophy of science and mathematics, and mathematics is so fascinating. The people who are now best at mathematics are people who just play the game of manipulating the symbols and who don't ask any questions about the meaning at all. I was completely the opposite. When when I during O-level encountered calculus and this bizarre situation where we're looking at, it's basically kind of Zeno's paradox, and we're taking smaller and smaller slices, and yet somehow we're coming up with a gradient between 2 points that are now so close together that they're indistinguishable, and that the answer we want seems to be where they become the same point. And yet how, if they become the same point, can there be a change in gradient between them? I mean, that's something that I wrestled with for a long time, and it made progressing with mathematics very, very difficult, especially because when I talked about the problems that I saw, you know, most mathematicians, a lot of mathematicians didn't really understand them. In fact, my physics and my professor at Professor Gillies, when I did a paper talking about this problem, and I explained, I mean, I started out at the paper and I explained that I understood what a limit is and how a limit works. I understand the concept of a limit, but I'm left with the question that, look, you know, the idea of a limit is dy by dx. You're dividing the change in height by this increasingly tiny change in your x-axis or your distance, right? You get smaller and smaller and you're dividing this increasingly small quantity by this increasingly small change. And the idea of a limit is, yes, you can get closer and closer and closer, but it never actually gets there. So there can always be this gradient. And I tried, the gist of my paper was this. But look, suppose, yeah, you can do a limit. I understand the limit. You can do a Zeno's arrow. It never gets there. It just gets closer and closer and closer to the target, but never reaches it. But look, just as an arrow can actually reach the target, whatever Zeno said. So if you keep making this smaller and smaller, dx will eventually become 0 and vanish. And here's the really weird thing. When dx becomes 0 and vanishes, dy doesn't. And that's what's going on, right? And I talked about that and how maybe we could solve it. And the response I got was, oh, well, I don't think you really understand limits. And I thought, well, don't I? You don't understand the bloody word I said. You've got some pat answer, and it just lets you shelve the real problem, the real uncertainty. Now, this is a big thing, right? Because if I'm right about in my solution, my solution has to do with interpretation, meaning, and it's connected to the idea that meaning doesn't reside. I have to talk about it a lot to really go through this, but we have problems with these little weird things collapse towards a division by 0 and the infinite quantities that we get when that happens. It's the singularity, right? These singularities, these points where everything seems to break down, these bound so much of our knowledge. And I believe I have a solution to that. I believe that there is a way of dealing with it, and a way of dealing with it that's interesting, a way of dealing with it that says actually what's outside of these singularities doesn't necessarily have to be vast and infinite in the way that we think about it. It's all related. Some of this is related to something called Skollem's paradox, where in a finite mathematical universe, you can actually have infinite entities, entities that from within your particular theoretical model are infinite, but from outside they can be quite small, most definitely finite. So I personally think that philosophy has a great deal to offer what's going on with the empirical sciences. I think if we can really crack the issue of division by 0, and I think it's quite crackable, if we do that, then physics could move on, and and the current need it has for philosophy could kind of evaporate. We would know where we're going again, and we could get on with it. And our universe could expand mightily. But a lot of the things that people are wrestling with today, I mean, I was personally wrestling with in the 60s and the 70s, including a lot of the sort of uncertainty and confusion about politics and things that were going on. So I have been in this place where you don't know how to proceed, you don't know what's going on, and there is no established path forward for a very long time. And what I can say is that philosophy has helped me, and that within that using some of the tools of philosophy, but within my life, where I'm not in academia just trying to pump out papers so that I can get tenure. And because if you don't pump out papers, nobody wants to employ you. I've been, right, so don't employ me. I don't really care. I'll get on with the things that really matter to me and really puzzle me. The things I've been wrestling with. And some of them I have made some progress on. And I will be talking about some of those things in these videos. And I think some of what I have to say about it might be interesting. So that's kind of my introduction. There's one takeaway from it. It's just the definition of philosophy is one of the things that I kind of have to offer. I think it can help. I think it can give a much clearer understanding of what goes on in philosophy, why it is that philosophy actually isn't a fruitless endeavor. But it has often, it's given rise to many different fruits. It gave birth to the empirical sciences. It's given birth to information technology. It's just that everything that it does successfully ceases to be philosophy. It becomes a discipline in its own right. And then the people who follow it forget that we gave birth to them, and they take the credit for the whole thing. Of course, they deserve some of the credit, but philosophy also deserves a bit of credit and a bit of respect and a recognition that it isn't fruitless, even though some of the problems that we wrestle with, some of the places that we don't know how to proceed, we still haven't found a way through. So that's my first video in my philosophical reflections.